So just a little bit of a story, like a background story about this project. Here she is. I'm going to talk about Anya. I'm sorry to put you on spot, Anya. So when I arrived at the Wilson Center, one of the things they told me is, no worries, you have a blank slate, you can create the vision for the future of the institute and so forth. And it was like, whoa, great, that's a fantastic thing. And then at some point, someone looked at me and said, oh, there's a project here that you might want to continue, because it started when Oscar Vilhena was here in 2018, correct? And Paulo Sotero, former director, and Anya Schifrin, who's here, also were leading the project, which was the translation of Battle of Powers, a book written by Oscar Vilhena, looking into Brazilian history from 2013 to 2018. And then I said, wow, Oscar Vilhena, I'm a fan, let's do it. And one of the things that as we move forward and live here in Washington, we learn is that context is very scarce when it comes to looking at Brazil and looking at Latin America. In this book brings a lot of context to our recent history, to the past 10 years, the tumultuous history that started with the riots in 2013. Whoever lived that knows that it marks an important moment in our recent history. And what came after that, with not only Bolsonaro election, but also the tumultuous relationship between the three branches of power in Brazil. And I think this book is narrates that history and also brings a lot of perspective into this very contemporary challenge that the Brazilian democracy faces today, not only with the rise of the far right, the presence of the far right, but also the balance across the three powers and how it relates to the US. So that's how we are going to frame this conversation. And once again, thank you so much, Oscar, for being here.
Well, thank you, Bruna. Now that I know that my book was there, you decided to revive them, I'm very glad. I really would like to thank Bruna she's a powerhouse, and she decided to put this project forward and did it, even though it was dormant since, I think, 2018. And this gap helped to complement the book, because in 2023, the Journal of Democracy asked me to write a piece on the Bolsonaro and the Supreme Court tensions. So this piece became the last part of the book. So the book really covers since the 2013 riots, manifestations that took place in major Brazilian cities that really destabilized the political system, opened the space for the impeachment of President Dilma, the conviction of former President Lula, the election of a far-right authoritarian Bolsonaro, and ends with an attempt coup in January 8, similar to what you had here on January 6, a different year, but it's the same thing. So basically the book covers this decade, this turmoil decade of tough institutional battles, and that's why the name of the book is Battle of Powers. I didn't want this title, but the editors in Brazil fought for this title, and I think they knew more about titles than myself. Anyway, so the book basically provides an institutional perspective over this period. So it is a book written by a law professor, not by a political scientist or a sociologist, even though there is a little bit of sociology and political science in it. My lenses is the lenses of institutions. So the premise of this book is that institutions matters, and I will try to understand both the roots of the instability in the Brazilian institutions and how they behave under attack in this period. So it's a very institutional way of approaching this phenomenon. Just as Bruna said, the book has some context, some institutional context. So it tries to explain to a foreign reader how the Brazilian very consensual model of democracy was built in 1988 after the transition to the military regime. So what I mean by very consensual model is a model where power has been fragmented, both in the federal level as in the separation of powers. So Brazilian political system have a lot of veto places. So in some sense, the Constitution is a reaction to the authoritarian immediate regime that it was succeeding, but also it is a reaction for a longer background of authoritarianism and populism. So the Constitution was organized in a very defensive way. So that's the last chapter is called the defensive democracy. So how the Constitution was organized to defend democracy under attack. I was in a panel with Professor Levitsky in São Paulo some month ago, and he said, yes, our Constitution was much more trustful in democracy, so our defenses are not that strong. And the Brazilian Constitution was very careful in building all these defenses that were articulated in this last period of Bolsonaro, and this is perhaps something that we should be focusing on. My friend Matthew Taylor asked me to give more attention in this talk about the role of the Supreme Court, which coincides with your perception. So one thing that really characterized the Brazilian political system since 1988 is the conjunction of two factors. The Constitution was built in a moment of a lot of distrust within the political elite. So it's a different kind of constitution that is built after the transition. So if you have the Indian Constitution, 51, if you have the Constitution of South Africa, if you have the Constitution of Colombia, first they solved large part of the conflict, and then the winners made the Constitution. The Brazilian Constitution was not built only by the winners. It is a compromise within the Constitution. So it's a very distrustful document. And that explains why it's so detailed, because everything should be arranged in detail. So it's an extended Constitution, an expanded Constitution, and that entrusts a third party to be the arbiter of the conflicts that would arise after the Constitution was implemented. So a lot of power were transferred to legal institutions, but most of all, they were transferred to the Supreme Court. So the Brazilian Supreme Court that was created in 1891 with the first Republican Constitution, modeled after the US Constitution, received the powers that are granted normally to the constitutional courts of the European systems. So what is the major difference for those who are not lawyers here? The timing of the involvement of the court in political issues. Here, the political issues, they start in the lower courts and they grow to the Supreme Court that review cases. In constitutional courts, they can go directly. So a conflict could happen in Congress on Monday, and on Tuesday, the case arrived at the Supreme Court. So the time of the involvement of the Supreme Court is very fast. So the Brazilian Supreme Court has all the powers of the US Supreme Court. However, it has all the powers of a European Constitutional Court. The third element is that the court is very easily accessed by several powers, and most of all, by political powers, so political parties. So every party in Congress has the capacity to bring cases, constitutional cases, to the court immediately. So what we have seen along these 35 years is that the losers in any majoritarian dispute at Congress would bring a case to the Supreme Court to second-guess the Congress, which it has happened many times. So really it became a chamber of revision of Congress in immediate time. And that's, I think, it's important because they take the political issues in hot terms. Fourth element, the court is responsible for criminal cases of every major member of the cabinet, the president, and Congress, which means it's a first instance criminal court over political elite of the country. And what we have seen in the Mensalão crisis, when it convicted several members of the PT government at that time, and also during this last scandal of corruption. So the court really handles enormous capacity of constraining members of Congress because they are those who can be convicted by the court. Okay? So you have four elements. You have an immense constitution that is guarded by the Constitutional Court, so it can get involved in any moral, economic, political issue at any time. It is very easily accessed. It has the capacity of interfering as the European Court, and also the court handles criminal cases against the political elite. The fifth element, which is sometimes more difficult to understand, the court has the capacity to declare unconstitutional amendments that attempt to abolish federation, separation of powers, democracy, and rights. Okay? So the core of the Constitution is protected against amendment to the Constitution, and the court has exercised it. So it has really the final word in the political system. What happened in the United States in the 20s, when the Supreme Court said, well, income taxes is unconstitutional, so let's make an amendment. In Brazil, it is risky that the Constitutional Court would say, okay, but the constitutional amendment is also unconstitutional. So really, it's a very empowered court. So, but this empowered court obviously lost a lot of its capital during the Mensalão and during the political scandals, because it really brought some important figures and very popular figures to be convicted, and lost a lot of confidence to the left from 2008 to 2015, 17. I think the court is, I'm not just guessing, you can read all the polls on the trust over the court. The court lost a lot of trust on the left and grow a little trust on the right. The interesting aspect is that the court has also been very progressive in terms of rights. So there was also, and there is more now, a lot of distrust by the very conservative in the court. So in cases like affirmative action, gun control, environmental cases, indigenous people cases, the court was a gay marriage. The court was always endorsing the progressive measures. So in the end, in 2018, the court achieved its lowest point in terms of trust on the right because it's progressive, and on the left because of its corruption investigations and cases. So the court was really in the low. And this exactly moment where we most needed the court because Bolsonaro was elected, and Bolsonaro, since his campaign, manifested that he would attack the court. There is an interview of one of his sons saying, well, we just need a soldier in a jeep to close the court, because this was a dialogue during the military regime. If the court granted an habeas corpus to ex-politician, the president said, well, I send there a soldier in a jeep, and they will close the court. So they reinvented this idea that the court could be interfered.
Forgive me, I'm a business and economics person, but who appoints nominees to the Supreme Court? In other words, here it's the president. Is it the same in Brazil?
It's exactly the same model. So the president appointed, Senate approve it, okay? So since 1891, it has been this system. Just one person has not been ratified by Senate, so all of the others have. It's interesting that the court, during the two authoritarian periods from 37 to 45, the Vargas, and 64 to, there was some resistance by the court. Some of its judges were retired forcefully. So the court has always been very preeminent. You know, periods with more alliance with the regime, but it's not I would say, acanhada, a court, a timid. It's not a timid court at all. However, after 1988, it received a lot of institutional power. And that's what I'm trying to focus. It's not accidental that the court was capable of facing an authoritarian threat. It's because it had the institutional power. And it exercised its muscles in the last 35 years in very important cases, okay?
But then alternatively, so does it lean, either to the left or the right because of who appointed the justices?
It is different, I think, because we do not have a very clear bipartisan system. So Brazil is much more complicated in terms of the enormous number of political parties. So normally the members of the court are not viewed as party-oriented, okay? However, obviously, we can see that there are more conservative and more progressive members, and since they stay for a long time, they shift along the way. So this is the difference. I think the court is not viewed as bipartisan as your court, even though the right tend to say that there are too many progressive. So Bolsonaro, when was there, promised we need to have a conservative evangelical on the court, which we have now. So, but the court is, I would say, objectively describing, that is mostly a progressive court. It has been a progressive court at least from 2003 on, because the members of the court appointed by the military, they retired normally. So when we made the transition to democracy, the military appointed justices remained there. So this is very interesting how the transition, the court was perhaps entrusted with controlling the political process because the court was, the legacy of the authoritarianism. So it's interesting how the timing of things influence the decisions in how we architect the court. So my point in this, and then I will be, closing so we can have questions. The interesting is that the court was in its weakest point when Bolsonaro was elected, and the first year it represented this. The court was very deferential to the president. The president of the court at that time, Justice Toffoli, even brought a term, say, let's create a Republican pact to calm down the situation, and perhaps we could help the government to approve some of its measures. So this was very, the court became very deferential to the government in the first months of this. However, the attacks of the far right to the court were becoming more and more, in some sense, intense. And then the pandemic arrived. And the position of the president regarding the pandemic was, negating everything, negating science, negating the vaccines, etc. And the president started to interfere with the states in promoting policies to combat the pandemic. And then there was a federal conflict, and the court arbitrated totally in favor of the states, saying if the president was not accomplishing with his duties, the state should have all the power to move on. So this was the first very conflict, and said that science should guide the comeback to the pandemic. So then the conflict between the court and the president intensified. The attacks, there was in April 4th, of 2020, a march against the court, and the president was at the march. Then you have the September 7th, which is the Independence Day in Brazil. There was an enormous manifestation in São Paulo, and the president said that the court should take care, because if they don't take care, he would not accept its decisions anymore. So there was a lot of threats. There were groups threatening the life of some justices. So then it came a very peculiar moment and a key moment on this conflict. The court started an investigation against the radical groups that threatened the court. And obviously that liberal lawyers like myself would say, well, but does the court has the power to investigate someone? And the last chapter of the book really covers this question and the reasoning provided by the court to assume this position to investigate radical groups. The case is very Byzantine in some sense, because the internal rules, the bylaws of the court, o estatuto, regimento interno, okay, the internal regiment, I don't know, the bylaws of the court, Article 43, that never have been invoked before, said that if a crime occurs on the premises of the court, it is under the jurisdiction of the court to start an investigation. Okay, so the president of the court decided that since the crime of threatening the life of justices occur on the internet, and the internet really crossed over the plenary of the court, it was an attack on the court. It was happening on the premises of the court, so it decided to start an investigation. So this case received rapidly several lawsuits against this case, and it was decided some months later by one of, for me, the most undisputable correct justices in the court, Justice Fachin, who said, well, there is several peculiarities on this case. First, we have jurisdiction over it because it happens in the court. Second, there is a real threat to democracy and to the independence of powers. It's not an abstract threat, because the president, the head of the army, and radical groups are threatening the courts. So it's not an abstraction. Third, and this for me is the strongest argument, the Attorney General, the federal police, and the intelligence agencies are in omission. They are not doing their role, which is mostly the Attorney General to protect democracy, which is in the Constitution. It's the first responsibility of the Attorney General is to protect democracy. So if we have a real threat, if the crime occurs in the court, if the agencies that are responsible to bring a case are in omission, yes, we can start an investigation. And through this investigation that was handled by this peculiar justice called Alexandre Moraes, who has been a prosecutor, Secretary of Security, a very tough person. Everyone said, well, he's a judge, but he's really a police officer. He started this investigation and amplified this investigation to fake news, deep radical groups. In some sense, he explained it at the Cardozo Institute when we were debating this last chapter. He said, yes, in fact, I was fulfilling the role of the intelligence that was an absolute omission because of Bolsonaro. So this is part of the book discussed this power, what in the German doctrine is called the militant democracy doctrine, which was written by a Jewish jurist in the 30s called Karl Loewenstein, who fled to U.S. and wrote this piece called The Militant Democracy. What should be the role of courts and other bureaucratic agencies to protect democracy when electorate decided to threaten democracy? So this is a very debatable doctrine, but in fact, the constitutions that were built after the Second World War, many of them introduce this concept in the Constitution. So it's not just a doctrine that provides the discretionary power for justices to protect democracy, but they inserted mechanisms in constitutions to protect. And I think the Brazilian constitution is a quintessential example of a defensive democracy model, a defensive model that approved a very important law in 2021. We substitute the old Lei de Segurança Nacional, National Security Act, organized by the military, by a law to defense of democracy, which create 3 crimes: attempt to coup d'etat, attempt to abolish the rule of law, and attempt to impede the results of elections. So it's interesting that all this investigation were being implemented by the court with this background of a law that really criminalized these activities. So then we have the election. By 1.8%, I think Lula won, and there was this attempted coup on January 8th. And the court was investigating these cases, and the result of this is more than 1,000 people have been indicted, and several of them are already convicted by attempted coup. And now there are several members of the military, including the former chief of the army, the former chief of the navy, that are being investigated, and perhaps, and I think they probably will be convicted, and the president probably will be convicted. Final, just footnote, the Supreme Court has a sister court, the Electoral Court. So the Electoral Court is a very peculiar institution. Brazilian institution. It has 90 years old. It's a very old institution, which is a court composed of judges of the other courts. So the Superior Electoral Court is composed of 3 members of the Supreme Court, 3 members of the Superior, the Court of Appeals, let's say, and 2 other members that are appointed as lawyers to become part of it. So there was a lot of Bolsonaro during his campaign, as happened here with Trump, tries to delegitimize the electoral process, and most of all to delegitimize the electronic ballot box that we use. As you know, Brazilian elections happen, more than 100 million people vote, and in 3-4 hours you have the results because everything is electronic. So Bolsonaro made a huge campaign, tried to pass an amendment to the Constitution to retire the ballot box and return to the paper work. The Supreme Court played an enormous role. So if you approve, it will be considered unconstitutional, etc. Anyway, so there was this threat. And there was a commission of technicians or technical people that were supporting the activities of the Electoral Court, and there was a military on this commission. And this military person started to question really the trustability of the ballot box. And there was a specific event where the Minister of Defense came to the court and say, if you don't implement all the suggestions made by the military, we will not support the results of the election. And I have a mission to implement the results of the election. And the president of the court said to the Minister of Defense, if you try to do this, I will imprison you. So there was a real situation of conflict between the military and the courts. There were threats over the court in the past by other chief of the military. So the tension is organized among a concept, and this, I will finish with this, a concept of moderating power. Okay, Brazil in 1824, when we became independent from Portugal, it was a very innovative institutional design because it has 4 powers. So the executive, the legislative, the judiciary, and the moderating power, which is the emperor power. And when we transitioned from the monarchy to the republican, there was a question, who will be the moderating power in the republic? And obviously, the designers of the Constitution, Rui Barbosa, who's a kind of the medicine person in Brazil, said, well, the new Supreme Court that we are inventing. So the conflict among powers will be solved by the court. However, as Alfred Steppen, a very good Brazilian, wrote it, the military stole this function from and became the real moderating power from 1891, at least to 1964, when the military regime arrived. So my belief is that after 1988, the Supreme Court, in some sense, reoccupied the function of the moderating power in the Brazilian political system. And the military never accepted that. So this is what is happening. So Brazil is a very defensive democracy model. And I don't like to draw comparisons among systems, even though I think I understand a little bit of how the U.S. democracy functions. But I think Levitsky is right in the sense that the old U.S. Constitution does not provide the sufficient mechanism to protect the U.S. democracy from authoritarian cycles. And I think constitutions as the Brazilian ones could provide some of the examples of how important this mechanism could be, not to sustain democracy, but to protect democracy in moments of very specific crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can I start with one question, which is, well, I think it's very clear to us the timeline of the 2013, the protests, and then we have a very turbulent period of time with an economic problem as well that brought people to the streets and like very a growing public resentment and a growing polarization in society. Whoever lived from 2013 to 2020 in Brazil saw that growing polarization, which was not that evident back in 2013. And then this growing tension between the legal establishment, which was independent and strong, and the political party system, which was already strained, and this establishment of political institutions, that growing tension also had in the backdrop car wash operation, obviously. But then you cut there, and then you shift to 2024, yesterday or the day before, when we saw the indictment to former President Bolsonaro. And then we see Lula, who was a former, left prison to take the presidency. Bolsonaro being investigated in a number of processes. We see a relatively weak executive branch in terms of power and vis-a-vis the Congress and the Supreme Court. We see disrespects from the Congress in terms of the legislative process. Disrespecting meaning like voting in urgency, processes that should be more clear and transparency. And you see, some would say, the Supreme Court overstepping that, especially looking at more recently, and I didn't have the chance to discuss this before with you, but I really want to hear your thoughts, more recently when the Supreme Court ruled about the use of AI during the elections. So with that, but my question is, I'm just like narrating a little bit of the context for me to ask you a question. But my question is, there is a political backdrop there, which for us here, we think about how Brazil is somehow becoming a graveyard of evidence in corruption fighting. We saw that the Supreme Court annulled a number of evidence on cases of corruption, and it's affecting not only Brazil, but the region. It has affected Panama, it has affected Peru, it has affected Colombia, even like organizations that were building an electric plant in the border of Venezuela. So it has systemic impacts, no doubt about that. So I want to hear more of your thoughts about that political backdrop. We So tell me more. Tell us more. Illuminate me.
Should we take more questions, or I
Just
started
comment
by-
on that.
Okay.
Comment on that, and then we open for questions. Is that all right?
All right, perfect, perfect, thank you. I think when the Brazilian Constitution was made, there was a consensus among political scientists that the model, how we describe the functional model of our political system, was a coalitional presidentialism. What it means is that you elect the president, but the party system is so fragmented that the president would have to build a coalition to govern. So that was the name of the game. So Cardoso started with 3 parties, his coalition, and some of the parties were considered not as in the center as he was. So he was center-left, and he brought a coalition with 2 other parties that were more on the right, okay? Lula governed with 6 parties. Dilma has to deal with 13 parties in her coalition. And Lula now has more than 24 parties in his coalition. Okay? So, the cost to create a coalition in Brazil has always been high and increased with time. We can explain why it increased with time. The Supreme Court made a lot of mistakes, right, that I will, we can spend hours discussing this. However, this, in some sense, create an enormous opportunity for political corruption. So the cost of elections are very high because we don't have a district system. We have a proportional system, and then, so the size of the districts in the state of São Paulo is 40 million people district, so 70 winners per district. So it costs a lot to make campaign in Brazil. So a lot of these cases of corruption are linked with the financing of political campaigns. Mm-hmm. So I don't know anyone serious in Brazil that would not say that this happens in a scale, in a large scale. So the car wash operation started by one judge in Paraná called Judge Moro. I think he came here to the Wilson Center once. And a group of federal prosecutors, one of them called Deltan, which was very radical prosecutor. And they start this investigation, and this investigation involved a shift on the Brazilian criminal law, which included, for the first time, the plea bargaining. We'd never had plea bargaining before. And we introduced plea bargaining in the system when the president was in case, the members of Congress. So it's like, to use a soccer metaphor, the VAR, which is a new system, electronic system to see if there was a goal, there was a penalty or not, was inserted in the word final game, not tested before. So this is a legal perspective, that this changed completely how the legal system behaved and made the legal system extremely powerful because it came from one investigator to another and created a whole system and find out the whole system of political corruption. So this really had an enormous impact in the political system. I think the ambitions of the judge and the prosecutor that several of us denounce at the moment, saying that they were breaking the rule of law, etc., led to a backlash on this initiative. And the Supreme Court, in some sense, were backing the investigations until the point that some members of the court became investigated by the operation. So you have a first instance judge investigating a member of the court. And I think the backlash started at this point. I will not make any judgment of this, but from the legal perspective, it was an abusive investigation. From the moral perspective, it's obviously very concerned that a member of the court could be investigated. It's a very problematic issue. So the court changed its perspective and started to control this investigation to the point that annulled the decision that convicted President Lula. So that was when the really, so it is a problem. How you made a enormous investigatory procedure involving the political system without being instrumentalized by the opposition. So I think all these things happen in the Mensalão case, and it's very bad that the Supreme Court was not able at the moment, at the beginning, to give the limits to the first instance courts. They allow them to move on, to make this very ubiquitous investigation, and afterwards they start to annul the decision. So I think the Supreme Court is the one who to be blamed about what is happening with investigatory corruption scandals. And it's part of why its trust decreased after 2019, 2020.
So I would start with a question from Renata, our fellow, then Benjamin get done here. Renata, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So first of all, thanks for this incredible talk. I'm Renata. I'm a fellow here at the Wilson Center from Brazil. And during the time of the Bolsonaro government, I coordinated the Civic Space Program at the Garapé Institute. So I had the pleasure of hearing some of your thoughts before. My question is a little bit, two questions actually, but one along the lines of Bruna was asking, I wanted to ask you, it was very important to have the court there during that particular moment. But what led Bolsonarismo is really the mistrust of the population regarding its institution, and this mistrust is still there. And so you said they exercised their muscles, but isn't that has become a problem now? And how do we address the narratives that are going within the far right that the threat to democracy comes now from the Supreme Court? That's one question. The second is about public policies. When I arrived here and I had interaction with, people from Venezuela, South Sudan, and others, I was like, well, I also had an autocrat government. But I see the difference. I see how different Brazil case is from other cases. But I wanted to have your perspective on the matter of how public policies are implemented. What's the limit between a bad public policy, just bad policy, and a policy that does not fulfill what it's supposed to do, like what Bolsonaro did during the pandemics, or the environmental degradation that was the result of awful policies? And so is that a threat to democracy? Thank you.
Renata, thank you for the two questions. Let me start by the second one, which is easier. Okay, some of these thoughts were criticized by some political scientists, saying, "Well, Bolsonaro is not an authoritarian; he's just a conservative, and as a conservative, he's aggressively trying to change policies on environmental issues, on education, on issues that are very viewed as progressive issues." Okay? So your criticism is wrong. So that was the point. Okay? Every shift in power, in some sense, leads to shift in policy, which is natural. That's why we need a democracy, because we need to change, adapt, correct. So, in fact, we are just angry because a right-wing government achieved power, and now they are shifting to conservative policies. In fact, I must say we, because we have a research group working on this, okay? So several of the conclusions, not my own conclusions here. We try to make this distinction. So the question is that since we have a very ambitious constitution, several of these policies are in the constitution, okay? Let's take indigenous rights. You have the right to the original land is there in the Constitution. The government has the responsibility to protect this land, to protect the indigenous people. When Bolsonaro arrived to power, and as Bruna said, he was in our line of presidencies, now Lula is in the same position, the weakest president of all in terms of his rate of success within Congress. So he couldn't approve much, right? So he could not make an amendment to the Constitution to diminish the rights of the indigenous people. He could not even change the law. He didn't have the majority to change the law. And even if he changed the law, perhaps the Supreme Court would say, no, you cannot do this. So he forged a method of government that we call infralegalism, authoritarian infralegalism. So it's a way of eroding the Constitution without changing the letter of the Constitution, of eroding the major substantive laws without changing the letters of this. How he did this? Through the abusive decrees, so decrees that really were against the law, by nominating people to agencies that were in conflict with, and this, for those who are not lawyers, I'm sorry, I'm saying if lawyers knew something, but is that, what's the problem to nominate someone who is very conservative for an environmental agency? No problem. Wow. No, an environmental agency, when it's created by law, and its duty is to protect the environment. If you put a person in charge who says, I am against environmental protection, you are breaking the law. So, abusive decrees, nominating people that were against the mandate of the agencies that they run, and what we call para-institutional orders. So he would, to the Twitter, say, in my government, no one at the environmental agencies will bring fines against these nice people who are exploiting the Amazon. So obviously that if you nominate a guy who runs the agency in the Amazon, he understands that the others, no fine for these people who are cutting the trees. So Bolsonaro ran his government, and I think this has a lot of similarity with Trump in terms of trying to erode. The distinction is that perhaps the U.S. Constitution is more slim constitution without so much substantive issues. But the Brazilian Constitution has a lot of substantive issues. So it is authoritarian in the way that you try to change the Constitution through infralegal measures, which is authoritarian per se. So that is the point. And I think this also brought the court to a preeminent role. Why? Because every member of civil society, of Igarapé and Conectas, etc., would come to the court saying, this decree on guns is absolutely contrary to the law. So that's why I think the court was also brought to the scene of the political arena. And the first question was, well, several people mostly see the court today as a threat to freedom of expression, okay? And being a threat to democracy. And I think this is an important argument to take into consideration. If you take the old doctrine of militant democracy, what Levenstein was fighting at that time was saying, people like Hans Kelsen, a jurist in the German tradition, very liberal jurist, say, well, democracy is majority rule, and majority rule is achieved with some preconditions. One precondition is freedom of expression in an extreme way, okay? Then I think when you use freedom of expression to erode the conditions of democracy, should be granted the protection to freedom of expression. So this is a debate at the 30s, and I think this is a debate until this moment. People like Karl Popper, Karl Mannheim, who lived during the Nazism, they said, no, you cannot allow those who are enemies of democracy to use the guarantees of democracy to destroy democracy. But it is a very difficult theoretical debate, okay? In the case, if you read the final chapter of this book, there is a wonderful passage by Justice Faquin when he was allowing this investigation, say, tolerance should be the name of the game in a democracy. However, tolerance with those who use violence against democracy should not be tolerated. So he, in some sense, tried to put a condition for the interference of the judiciary to control, not expression, but expression that involved a threaten with violence. So I think this is the point. My view, and I have been speaking with Bruna, and every time the court makes a decision, she sends me a note, say, what about it? I would be, to be completely candid with you, yes, there are some decisions of Justice Moraes, who is this head of this investigation, that I think are inadequate. They are abusing of his power to control not the press, but the radical groups. Others, I think, feel exactly in this precondition that this is not just an act of rhetoric. It is an act of rhetoric made by someone who has guns, and this someone who has guns are really making threats. So I think it is case-by-case distinction. It's not an easy thing to do. So I don't feel that the Brazilian Supreme Court is a threat to the Brazilian democracy, but I really feel that some decisions of the Brazilian Supreme Court could be considered abusive.
Benjamin, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Benjamin Gadan. I direct our Latin America program here. And now we know where Bruna gets all of her brilliant legal analysis. Two quick questions. One broad question, which is, does the popularity of the Brazilian Supreme Court matter? Which is to say, you've described how it's lost what you called political capital on the left from the Mensalão investigation in Lava Jato, and how it lost support on the right in conflicts with Jair Bolsonaro and progressive rulings. So again, my question is, does it matter for the Brazilian democracy that the court is seen as popular, legitimate, a credible institution? And my second question is, you mentioned almost in passing that you think the former president will be investigated and convicted, and then you moved on. That seems like an important potential political development in Brazil, given his continued role among conservatives in the country. So I'd love to hear more about which of these many cases will eventually result in a trial, at what timeline, and whether, in fact, the former president would be convicted and even punished. Thank you.
Perfect. Benjamin, thank you. Thank you for the support for this project. It's very nice to meet you here. I also will start by the second question, which is easier, okay? It's more objective. Yeah, the president is involved in three kinds of cases. The first one was abuse of political power during the election, okay? So he has already been convicted by the electoral court, and the penalty was that he lost his political powers for political rights for 8 years, okay? So there are two distinct delicts on the electoral court. One is abuse of economic power, when you buy the elections, or when you interfere, interrupt, or dislegitimize the election. So if you had here with Trump, he would be on this first case. I don't know if he's in the second case also, but the first for sure. In one of the cases, he, as president, in the palace, he convoked all the embassies to say that the election would be a fraud in Brazil. So this is the case that he was convicted, okay? That he abused of his political power to delegitimize Brazilian election. There are many other events But this is the key event, okay? And also that he forced his Ministry of Defense to try to threat the head of the electoral court. So these are the two major events. He has been already convicted, so this shows how the courts are reacting to him. He cannot run for 8 years. Then there are several other issues pending on the Supreme Court. Some of them would go to lower courts. So there are all the pandemic behavior. Now, there are signs that he was with COVID and he hugged children, et cetera. So he exposed the public health. He tried to impede some acts of combating. So there are some criminal cases regarding his behavior during the pandemic. This will, as a former president, he will be tried on first instance. I'm not very convinced that he will be convicted on these cases. And then there are his involvement on the attempted coup on the January 8th, but now more and more evidence came about his behavior on December 2022 when he was still the president, and that there is a draft of a coup document transferring all the competences of the court to the military to handle the elections, etc. And there is several of the information and documents and emails and meetings and the testimony of the former chief of the Army and the former chief of the Air Forces saying that, yes, they were called to the palace to see if we would back a coup. So probably he will be convicted on that. So I hope they do not imprison him before the trial, which is important to show some. And he, last week, he spent some days at the Hungary embassy. So probably he had the information that perhaps he would be in prison. He ran to his fellow
get some pastries,
Orban. Anyway, so that's my perception. He will be convicted criminally for attempted coup, and he was already convicted for abusive power during the election.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry. Just to say, yeah, you are my legal mentor, and you also meu mentor legal. You are my nice mentor. But one thing, but there's a political understanding that what we call the political calculus, that there might be a lot of like riots if Bolsonaro is arrested that may avoid them moving forward. What do you think? A lot of people is saying that, and
Yes.
and then we have a
And then
question.
comes to Benjamin's second question. Yes, every court. Here we have an expert who's leaving, so I can put things
Oh
on his
no,
mouth.
he's gonna write later about it for our blog, right? Thank you, Matthew.
Every court measures its political decisions. There's an interesting professor in Chicago called Tom Ginsburg. He said they have a reputational capital, okay? They use the reputational capital in hard cases. So it's very good to have a good stock of a reputational capital, because when hard time comes, you have to use it. The question in Brazil is that I think the court use it irresponsibly in other cases, so it lost a lot of its reputational capital, and lost its reputational capital both with the left and the right. So that brought the court to a very difficult position. With its behavior during the Bolsonaro period, and the hardball played by the court against Bolsonaro, I think it reacquired a lot of support on the left, okay? It is an instrumental support. It's not a support as, religious support that, the old U.S. Supreme Court had in the past, which it disappeared also here. But it is, people see the Supreme Court on the side of democracy today. So yes, I don't think the court is in a wonderful position at the moment. It's seen as very politicized. The level of support of the Brazilian Supreme Court is a little higher than the level of support of the U.S. Supreme Court at this moment by, similar standards of measuring. But I think a lot of the support of the Supreme Court, the Brazilian Supreme Court support is level 42% of the population support the Supreme Court. Here's around 30 or something. However, this 42 is very instrumental. It's just people that, he saved my president, and that's why. So I think the court will have decades to overcome this situation. There is, on the fourth chapter of this book, there's a list, a to-do list, on how the court should control itself, how it should, the way they write their opinions, how they distribute the case among the justices. So yes, there are problems in the court that after the election of Lula, there was the president of the court was a woman, wonderful person called Rosa Weber, very discreet lady. And just after the election, she provided an amendment to the bylaws of the court, correcting several issues. So it was a sign, okay, we passed the darkest moment, so now we have to contain ourselves. However, some days later, January 8th, so yes, I think the court view that it has to control itself so it regain space, regain authority. I think the issue here is about authority.
Yeah, we have one question.
Yes. Carlos Faria, from political scientist from the Pontifical Catholic University of Minas Gerais, currently attached to the Center for Latin American Studies at Georgetown University. Many thanks for the exposition. Arguably, Brazil is now globally regarded as a very effective system in protecting democracy, particularly if we compare with what's going on in the USA now. My question is, quite bluntly, to what extent are we allowed to think, as we know nowadays that the planned coup d'etat encompassed the prison of a few individuals, including Alexandre de Moraes, to what extent are we allowed to think that the battle of powers is now being transformed into a battle of individuals?
Ooh. Carlos, thank you. Not for the question, because it's a hard one. Anyway, it is interesting on the literature about the role of the courts in protecting democracy. If we take Hungary, had a wonderful court. It was seen as the Jew of the new democracies. Poland has a strong court also. India has an immense, powerful court. South Africa has a powerful court. Turkey used to have an extremely powerful court. Okay? And Colombia has a very strong court. When we see all these cases, I think the best jurists that focus on this issue, like myself, think, really courts matter for this? Are courts capable of doing something? If you take these cases, you see that courts fail in most of them. So what in Venezuela was done, or in Hungary, was reforming the court and then passing amendments to erode democracy, and the courts were unable to do something. Turkey, exactly the same thing. So courts are not really powerful in the sense to contain authoritarian attacks when the attacks are supported by population and supported by the military, etc. So it's a weak member of this club of powers. So I think what happened in Brazil is that the court was capable to face Bolsonaro, to regain support on part of the population. I think it was a calculus. So when the court, and then comes to what Bruna asked before, I think the revision of the corruption cases in Brazil, it was really a calculus of regaining space with part of the population, because it would be impossible to face Bolsonaro and face the left at the same time. So I think the court played a political role. And, I cannot confront in the north Russia and in the south, so I'm not Napoleon. I learned something. I think the court really played politically in this period. Is this a good thing? No, it's not a good thing. This would reduce the authority of the court? Yes. Obviously, there is the counterintuitive thinking is, if the court has not done this, would we be here discussing democracy in Brazil, or would be, Bolsonaro in power with a breakdown of democracy? So these are hypothetical questions. I think what I can try to do in the book is try to describe the decisions. I don't buy the idea which is a personal confront, even when was Moro against Lula, now Alexandre. I think it's an institutional battle of powers. I think the Supreme Court is fighting for its predominance in the system, in the most Madisonian sense. People are not angels. If we organize powers as people to use their ambitions to protect or to expand its powers and control the other power, this is part of the game. So it's a very Machiavellian moment in Brazil, and I think the Supreme Court is playing this. And I think the court was concerned with Bolsonaro. However, the court was also concerned with the military. And I think this is a specificity of the Brazilian case, because we had an army with a tradition of intervention, with a tradition of intervention in key moments of the fragility of the political system. And the military manifested in several moments in the last few years that understood that the political system was incapable of dealing with itself, with its own mass. And the Supreme Court fought extensively to protect its jurisdiction against the military. So I think there is a battle of powers, but also there is a battle of institutions, the legal institutions, the deep state of the legal institutions, and the deep state of the military institutions were combating in the last few years. And I think Alexandre de Moraes is just a representation of this. It's a representation of the legal establishment in Brazil that was conflicting with the political establishment, and now is conflicting with the military establishment, and regain the alliance with the political establishment. So the first part of the book is the conflict between legal establishment and political establishment. The second part of the book is the conflict between legal establishment and the military establishment.
Yeah, just one thing to mention, especially because it's being recorded, and I want her to listen that, about Rosa Weber. I think often history forgets women, right? And when we think about the fact that she was one of the two female justices in the Supreme Court, which is now left with one, I think it's an important thing to say that we often hear, even like in the left, saying that Alexandre de Moraes was the savior of Brazilian democracy. I'm sorry, no, I think it was Rosa Weber. She was a very good at building consensus and making the court become one, and no longer a group of islands. Am I correct, Oscar? I think I think history will make her a favor by writing that story. We often don't hear that much, and the reason I want her to listen is because I've been trying to invite her for an event here at the Wilson Center, and I think this is an important message.
I would fully agree with you. I think she was a very discreet, quiet judge, a very good judge, And during the final phase of Bolsonaro, where the court was very fragmented, she was the one who brought the court to become collegial again.
United, yeah.
And it was impossible to criticize her because she is such a austere figure. And when the court was invaded by the mob on January 8th, she was there immediately after. And her image with a constitution that was burnt, it's an incredible image. And what she did afterwards. So yes, I would completely agree with you. I think her position and Justice Faquin, they were very close. Normally they vote together, are the two most important justices during this period, and not Alexandre. Alexandre is just a very flamboyant figure, but I think the persons who really did the job were these two.
We are like
it's being recorded.
no, yeah. This is we have one. I would take like one final question. The gentleman wearing a gray suit, please introduce yourself, and then we are ready to wrap up. I'm sorry we went over 15 minutes. You can.
Yeah, I know.
Asked me for a self-review. I see that you are mentioning a lot Levitsky, and I happened to be in Brazil in January 8th, 2023, and I was reading actually the book from Francisco Bosco, and he kind of used a lot of Levitsky idea of breaking the law of forbearance, and also how, in the case of Brazil, both the right and left wings basically disqualified each other, and that's the root somehow, as a political contender, legitimate political contender. And he mentioned specifically PSDB and PT. And I do see with some concerns some sort of breaking the law of forbearance by the current government. One of them, the historical forbearance of dealing with dictatorship. That will be the first time that a democratic elected government, mostly the PT government, do not make any public event with regards to the March 31st, which is for me is a shame. Basically being responsive to public appeal rather than the idea of building a democracy in Brazil. And the other symptoms of breaking the law of forbearance, for instance, the appointment of his personal criminal attorney as a member of the Supreme Court. So do you see that there are some law of forbearance being broken by the current government that will basically reinforce the trend that was opened, or the door that was opened by Bolsonaro, or other sort of law of forbearance?
The first chapter of the book is about the hardball play by both sides. So when you said the PSDB decision to disqualify the election there in 2014, for me was the starting point of this erosion, okay? So yes, I think Levitsky is right that playing hardball put in danger democracy. My argument for the Brazil was not an event of hardball, was a sequence of events that created a cycle of retaliation, so that resulted in the election of Bolsonaro. And then Bolsonaro is just an authoritarian trying to erode the system. But the democratic actors behave very badly from 2013 to 2018, and they should be responsibilized by endanger the Brazilian democracy. So this is my point. Second issue, the appointment of justices. I think Lula is following the Brazilian tradition of appointing people that are close by. If we see who are the justices appointed, several of them were ministers of justice, several of them were attorney generals, several of them were general lawyers. So, you know, Jobim appointed by Cardoso. He was his friend, his pal on the Senate. Then he was his minister. Then he was appointed. So this is the history. If you take here, you know, so this is part of the game. This is the system. Okay. I didn't like the appointment. I think it was a terrible appointment because it's a person who's a personal lawyer, who he didn't have any tradition, any. There is a person called Sepúlveda Pertence, perhaps the most important justice during this last democratic period in Brazil, who said, it's always dangerous to appoint someone with no reputation because you don't have anything to lose. Okay, so yes, but the second appointment is, it's a very important Justice Flávio Dino. So the question is, every president knows that the Supreme Court became a real power. So they are trying to instrumentalize the court. And I think this is, since Cardoso, Lula, Dilma, and now and Bolsonaro. So unfortunately, the court is becoming more and more politicized because of the choices made by these presidents. And I think the end of this game, we are seeing in the United States, a court that lost a lot of its authority because it's so politicized that it lost its authority. So it is a bad way of appointment, and when the circumstances makes the court move to such a bipartisan, where everyone knows what the court will decide. There is a jurist, old jurist, not very conservative, not very progressive, called Miguel Reale in Brazil, said, uncertainty is a good thing for law, because we need to expect it to trial. When we know in advance what will be decided, it's no law, it's politics. So I think it is a problem. That's what I can say.
Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thank you.